Chapter 4. The Three Stages of Consciousness. Observation of the actual facts of life seems to show us pretty distinctly that there are three stages or degrees of consciousness, and a consideration of the nature of knowledge, as set out in the foregoing paper, would tend to make us expect such three stages. There is the first stage of simple consciousness, in which the knower, the knowledge, and the thing known are still undifferentiated. Though we cannot observe this directly, nor draw the exact line at which it begins or ceases, we seem to be able to discern its existence clearly enough in the animals. The thought of self as the knower has not arisen upon them, except in low degree and in a few cases, and certainly the thought of the object as distinguishable from the knowledge or perception of it has not arisen. It is the same with very young children and some primitive men, and this non-differentiation of the self in consciousness explains in these cases various facts which are puzzling to us. The horse in the field stands out, patient and placid, through hours or days of cold and rain, simply because, not having a distinct consciousness of itself, cannot pity itself. It feels discomfort, no doubt. It may feel pain, but it does not project itself and think with dismay that itself will be feeling this discomfort, this pain, tomorrow. Small babies have little fear for the same reason. Nevertheless, fear in the higher animals and young children, apart from a mere instinct of escape, is there, and often very strongly. And this shows us that the consciousness of self is dimly beginning. Fear, in fact, is an inevitable accompaniment and means of the evolution of that consciousness. It is the midwife of a birth which in the far past of the human race has accomplished itself with much suffering. The knowledge and perception of animals, therefore, owing to this non-differentiation, and owing to the absence of certain causes of dislocation and trouble, is extraordinarily perfect and untampered. It is from the first a part of nature, and has a cosmic universal quality about it. Their knowledge is, as it were, embedded in the great living intelligent whole of the world. And therefore each special act of knowledge or perception carries with it a kind of aura or diffused consciousness extending far, far around it. We are aware of this aura or fringe of consciousness in ourselves, and the modern psychologists have dwelt much on it. Seton Thompson, in his Wild Animals I Have Known, speaks of them as being, quote, guided by a knowledge that is beyond us. And in his description of the wild horse which, quote, in spite of all reasons to take its usual path, came along another, and so avoided the pitfall set for it, he says, what sleepless angel is it watches over and cares for the wild animals? And again, but the angel of the wild things was with him, and that incomprehensible warning came. This daemonic or quasi-divine knowledge is, as we shall see, largely lost in the second stage of consciousness, but restored again in the third. The second stage is that in which the great mass of humanity at present is. It is that in which the differentiation of knower, knowledge, and thing known has fairly set in. The consciousness of self becomes more and more distinct, and with it the consciousness of an object antagonizing the self. Some folk say they remember the moment when, as quite young children, to them with a sense of alarm self-consciousness suddenly came. They were suddenly terrified at the thought of self, as of a separate item or atom in this vast world. Whether suddenly or gradually, this feeling, of course, has come to everyone. Its arrival can generally be noticed without difficulty in any young child. It is the beginning of a new era in its development, and from that moment life begins to shape round the self. But at the same moment, or very shortly after, the child begins to recognize the self in others, in its mother and those around. And what is curious and interesting, The child ascribes selves also to toys, stones, and what we call inanimate things. In fact, simultaneously with the appearance of the subject in consciousness comes the appearance of the object in consciousness. It is curious that at these early stages the object of knowledge and the knowledge should be differentiated from each other, or begin to be differentiated, but it is so. The child feels not only, as we do, that there is a personality behind the appearance of its mother, but that there is something behind these stocks and stones, and personifies them also. So does the savage. It is the period of fetishism, which correlates with and accompanies the first evolution of the idea of self. And in very truth, feeble and inadequate as this anthropomorphism may be, it will be seen, from what has already been said, that the child in this respect is wiser than the man, that its view is really more logical and rational than that of the practical person, who contends that the stocks and stones are the real objects, or who posits, in order to explain them, an ultimate, quote, matter devoid of intelligence. Anthropomorphism is inevitable to us in this second stage, and much the best we can do is frankly to accept it. Such then is the first birth of self-consciousness. But as the evolution of the idea of self goes on, there comes at last a kind of fatal split between it and the objective side of things. The kindly beliefs of early peoples in being similar to themselves, moving behind and inspiring natural phenomena, and the consequent sense of community of life with nature, fade away. The subject and object of knowledge drift farther and farther apart. The self is left face to face with a dead and senseless world. Its own importance seems to increase out of all reason, and with the growth of this illusion, for it is an illusion, the knowledge itself becomes dislocated from its proper bearings, becomes cracked and impotent, and loses its former unity with nature. Objects are soon looked upon as important only insofar as they minister to the elusive self, and there sets in the stage of civilization, when self-consciousness becomes almost a disease. When the desiring of acquiring and grasping objects, or of enslaving men and animals in order to minister to the self, becomes one of the main motives of life, and when, owing to this deep fundamental division in human nature and consciousness, men's minds are tormented with the sense of sin, and their bodies with a myriad forms of disease. Physiologically, this period is marked by the growth of the brain. In animals, the cerebrum is small. The great sympathetic system of nerves and the cerebrospinal system are relatively large. The cerebrum is only, as it were, a small organ attached to these systems to subserve their needs. But the growth of the intellect is at first stimulated by the growth of the, quote, self and its needs. And in man, the cerebral portion of the brain, as specially the seat of self-regarding relations, rises into immense importance, and over a long period lapses into a kind of conflict with the great sympathetic system, which, without doubt, is the great organ of the emotions. The emotions and the intellect of man for a long period are at variance, and distress and grief ensue in the mind, as, owing to the organic disharmony, pain and disease prevail in the body. Finally, with the complete antagonism of subject and object, of self and matter, and all the antagonisms which follow in its wake, of intellect and emotion, the individual and society, and so forth, and the terrible disruptions of life and society which ensue, comes the third stage. When the illusion of separation is complete and the man has sounded the depths of grief and pain which accompany this illusion, then, one day, often suddenly, the third form of consciousness dawns or flashes upon him. that which has been called the cosmic or universal consciousness. The object suddenly is seen, is felt, to be one with the self. The reconciliation is effected. The long process of differentiation comes to an end, and reintegration takes place. The knower, the knowledge, and the thing known are once more one. Objects turn round upon themselves with an exceedingly innocent air, but are visibly not the same. This form of consciousness is the only true knowledge. It is the only true existence. And it is a matter of experience. It has been testified to in all parts of the world and in all ages of history. There is a consciousness in which the subject and the object are felt, are known, to be united and one, in which the self is felt to be the object perceived. I am the hounded slave, or at least in which the subject and the object are felt to be parts of the same being, of the same including self of all. And it is only true knowledge, for we saw it at the beginning that the knower and the thing known are aspects of the act of knowledge, implicit in it, and not to be separated from it. The knower without the knowledge, or the thing known without the knowledge, being both unthinkable. Therefore they are really one in the knowledge, and though a differentiation takes place in consciousness, thus immensely enriching the knowledge, yet as soon as ever it becomes a separation, and the subject and object are thought of as isolated things, separate selves and atoms, for example. It has already passed over into a sphere of illusion and folly, and has become nonsense. The true knowledge, therefore, is that in which the subject and object are known as one, and is of course a much higher and more perfect form of knowledge than that first, as in animals, when subject and object are one, but never having been distinguished, are not known as one. When this consciousness comes, it brings with it a strange illumination, for the object and the ego are felt to be one, not only through the special act of knowledge which unites them, but deep down in their very essence. A circle is, as it were, completed, and the external act of knowledge is no longer merely external, but is transformed into a symbol of vast underlying life. The aura, in fact, of the animals returns with greatly increased intensity, to such a degree, we may perhaps say, that it becomes the main thing, and the object or external experience is only of importance as waking it. It is not merely that the object is seen by the eye or touched by the hand, but it is felt at the same instant from within as a part of the ego. And this seeing and touching wake an infinite response, a reverberation through all the chambers of being, such as was impossible before. The knowledge, in fact, loses its tentative elusive form of thought, and acquires a cosmic, universal character. It becomes luminous with far-reaching interpretations. How shall we denote or explain these things? It is obvious that mere thought, belonging to the second stage of consciousness, does not and cannot possibly cover them, any more than a man can walk a square mile. Thought can and does bring us to the edge of the third stage, and within sight, as it were, of the essential facts of the universe, and its value in that respect alone is immense. But like the mule at the edge of a glacier, there is a point where, from the nature of the case, it has to be left behind. We cannot obviously prove the ultimate constitution of things, but that which the third order of consciousness conveys, we can illustrate and symbolize in thought. To illustrate the two orders of consciousness we may, for instance, figure a tree, in which two leaves observe each other externally for a long enough time, mutually exclusive, and without any suspicion that they have a life in common. Then the self-consciousness of one of the leaves deepening inwardly down the twig or branch at last reaches the point whence the self of the other leaf also branches off, and becomes aware of its unity with the other. Instantly its external observation of its fellow leaf is transformed. It sees 1,000 meanings in which it never saw before. Its fellow leaf is almost as much an expression of self as itself is, for both now belong to a larger self, that of the spray or branch from which they depend. Or, when two strangers, of different race and tongue perhaps, meet, they eye each other with suspicion and misunderstanding, and seem to catch only at the most external knowledge of each other, to notice the slant of the brow or the cut of the clothes. But when two folk know each other in the sense of love, love being a consciousness of the third kind, instantly a word or a glance of the eyes in the external world reveal abysmal depths in the two selves, and a sense of age-long union. Without the external knowledge, the two could not know either themselves or the other person, since, as we have seen, the self without the knowledge is unthinkable. But in the second case, the knowledge is transformed, and reveals meanings and depths of the self imagined before. In the case of two persons, the transformation of knowledge in the third stage of consciousness is easy to understand, since here the so-called subject and object are commonly recognized to be of the same nature, and to have some degree of identity. But in the case of a man observing, say, a tree, we find it more difficult. Yet in truth, the process appears to be quite similar. Some people, like Jacob Boehme, the mystic, have been conscious of the hidden qualities of plants and trees they looked on, and innumerable instances of second sight, well authenticated, most convince us that, in cases, the direct external act of perception brings with it far outlying and underlying tracts of knowledge and illumination. The external knowledge is transformed by being brought into relation with the original source of knowledge, or the unity of all beings. It is, in fact, that hidden knowledge realized and made external. To borrow a simile from electricity, the luminous are springs into being when the circuit is complete, and is the evidence and manifestation of that completeness. This third mode of consciousness is, I say, the only perfect knowledge, for the first mode, though nearer to the third than the second is merely inchoate, while the second mode is sheer illusion. It, the second mode, is all built upon the separation of the self from the knowledge and from the object, or from other selves. It is therefore built upon an illusion, and is itself illusion. Its form is not true knowledge, but thought. Thought is an aspect. It is the last disintegration of knowledge. It is the fact seen from just one most particular and separate point of view. The hidden fact being the unity of my, quote, self with that of the tree. All my thought about the tree is an attempt to get at that fact from ever-shifting, ever-countless sides, but remains profitless, barren, productive of little but unrest and disappointment, till the moment when the reintegration takes place, subject and object close in one, and the innumerable thoughts fusing in the intense heat of union, lose their separateness and merge in perfect light. Herbert Spencer touches this point with a kind of unwilling illumination when, speaking of the impossibility of knowing the substance of mind, he says, quote, "A thing cannot at the same instant be both subject and object of thought, and yet the substance of mind must be this before it can be known. Certainly a thing cannot at once be subject and object of thought, or of the second stage of consciousness, because this stage is built on the separation and antagonism of subject and object. But that a thing may be subject and object of the third stage, experience shows, and the thing, that thus becomes both subject and object, is the self, which corresponds to Spencer's substance of mind. Thus we conclude that the self or substance of mind, though it cannot be known in the second stage, may or must be known in the third stage of consciousness, and indeed that this is the only way in which it can be known. Of the existence of this third form of consciousness, there is evidence all down history, and witnesses, far removed from each other in time and space and race and language, and perfectly unaware of each other's utterances, agree so remarkably in their testimony that there is left no doubt that the experience is as much a matter of fact as any other human experience, though the capacity for it is of course not universal. The authors of that extraordinary series of writings, the Upanishads, founded evidently the whole of their teaching on this experience. Their object in the teaching was to introduce others to the same knowledge. Quote, "He who beholds all beings in the self, and the self in all beings, he never turns away from it. When to a man who understands, the self has become all things, what sorrow, what trouble, can there be to him who once beheld that unity? Tat tavam asi, thou art that, says his father to Svetaketu, pointing to object after object, and trying to make him feel that the subtle essence of all things is his true self. Knowledge has 3 degrees, says Plotinus: opinion, science, illumination. It, the last, is absolute knowledge founded on the identity of the mind, knowing with the object known. God is the soul of all things, says Eckhart. He is the light that shines in us when the veil of division is rent. Whitman speaks of the light that came to him. Light rare, untellable, lighting the very light, beyond all signs, descriptions, languages, and says, strange and true, that paradox hard I give. Objects gross and the unseen soul are one. And Tennyson, in a well-known passage, distinguishing the ordinary knowledge from the other, says, for knowledge is the swallow on the lake, that sees and stirs the surface shadow there, but never yet hath dipped into the abysm of all abysms, beneath, within, the blue sky and sea, the green of earth, and in the millionth of a grain, which cleft and cleft again for evermore, and ever vanishing never vanishes. And more, my son, for more than once when I sat all alone, revolving in myself, that word which is the symbol of myself, the mortal limit of the self was loosed, and passed into the nameless as a cloud, melts into heaven. I touched my limbs, the limbs were strange, not mine, and yet no shadow of doubt, but utter clearness, and through loss of self, the gain of such large life as matched with ours, were sun to spark, unshadowable in words, themselves but shadows of a shadow world. And so on. But it is not only the great prophets and seers who prove to us the existence of another stage of consciousness. For to almost all mankind flashes or glimmers of the same thing come in those moments of exaltation or intuition, which form the basis of religion, art, literature, and much even of practical life. Schopenhauer, who has written well on art and music, says that art and the sense of beauty give us the most real knowledge of things, because then we see the object as the, quote, realization of an idea, or as a form, according to him, of the world soul. And the beholder, who has the same world soul within himself, becomes the clear mirror of the object, and the distinction of the subject and object vanishes. And everyone, whether he agrees with Schopenhauer or not, must have felt in poetry, music, and art generally, and in all cases where the sense of beauty is deeply roused, that strange impression of passing into another world of consciousness, where meanings pour in and illuminate the soul, and the distinction between subject and object vanishes. The evidence, I say, for the existence of this third stage of consciousness is ample and convincing, and though to do the subject justice would require a volume, yet we can see even from what has already been said that this cosmic sense is perfectly normal and in the line of human progress, and that it surpasses the ordinary consciousness of the second stage as far indeed as that surpasses the first. It is indeed, from its very nature, as already explained, or the union of subject and object, the only true and absolute knowledge, and this view of it is corroborated by the testimony of those who have experienced it. It is also the only true existence, at least that we can imagine, for as we have seen, the world consists of what is known, or of what enters into consciousness. Consciousness is existence, and the perfect consciousness is the perfect and true existence. That universal consciousness, by and in which the subject knows itself absolutely united to the object, is absolute existence, or being. All things and the whole universe of space and time really exist and are in this third state, a state where every object, or portion of the whole, is united to every other object, or portion, by infinite threads of relation, such infinitude of relations constituting the universal consciousness as embodied in that object. This is the state of absolute being in which all things are, and from which the things which we ordinarily see and know proceed by disintegration or ignorance. It is the state from which they lapse or fall by disintegration into ordinary consciousness or thought. That is to say, the real tree exists, and can be seen in the resplendent light of the universal consciousness. But the tree which we ordinarily look upon is only the merest aspect of its infinitude, a few isolated thoughts or relations, which the botanist or the woodman may happen to separate off and call the tree, the method of ignorance. All the universe exists, and is in this third state of consciousness, but we in the strange condition of illusion which belongs to the second stage, exiles from the Eden garden, persuaded of the separateness of our individual selves, and unable to enter into true knowledge, are content to gnaw off tiny particles, which we call thoughts, from the great reality. Assimilating and digesting these as best we can, we are persuaded that some day, putting all the results together, we shall arrive at the reality. But the quest by this method is obviously hopeless. Infinities of infinity stretch before us, and vistas of brain-gnawing misery. Arrive doubtless we shall, but it will be by another route. One day when man has passed the, quote, rodent stage, he will enter quite naturally and normally into another world of being, surpassing that in which he now lives, as much as the present surpasses the world of simple consciousness, belonging to the snail or the fish. Then, though he will perceive that his illusions of thought and self have not directly opened the door for him, he will find that they have fitted him for a realization of the truth, such as perhaps he could have obtained in no other way.